You know, the United States is undergoing some really profound demographic changes. One is the huge growth in the racial minority populations, especially what I call new minorities, Hispanics, Asians, people of two or more races, really have exploded over the last 15 or 20 years. Counter to that is kind of a very slow growth and soon decline in the white population, which is aging very rapidly. In fact, the only part of the white population that's growing markedly is the over age 65 population, as baby boomers sort of move into those ages. Now, these demographic changes affect lots of things, but they're also affecting voting in the United States. Now, if you look in the background and see how different racial groups have voted, you'll see that most of the minority populations, especially African Americans, have voted strongly Democrat for the last 10 years or so. In fact, the black population has voted Democratic going all the way back to FDR, but very big numbers since the 1960s, since the Civil Rights Movement. You see very strong Democratic support among African Americans. Among Hispanics, it's come on a little bit more slowly, but especially in the last 10 or 15 years, we see relatively strong Democratic support among Hispanics. Asians actually voted Republican in the 1990s, but that changed after 2000 and into the elections, the presidential elections and other elections since then. We see many more Asians voting Democratic. The outlier of this is the white population. At least in presidential elections, the white population has voted Republican in every election since 1968, and that continues to be the case. So now obviously there are shifts within each of those groups about how people vote. But if you just look at those racial categories, what you'll see is that states that are becoming more racially diverse, that is having fewer proportionately whites, more proportionately blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, tend to vote more Democratic. And this has been the case really in the last 3 presidential elections. It certainly had a lot to do with electing Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. And of course, the older white population tended to vote Republican. They had a lot to do with electing Donald Trump in 2016. Well, white anxiety is a term that gets to be used a lot. There are a lot of op-eds written about it, a lot of commentary about it. And I found when I've looked at a lot of survey data and a lot of election data that at least around the 2016 election, a lot of whites were a little bit concerned about this changing demography that we're having in the United States, the fact that we're becoming more racially diverse. A lot of older whites, people my age, for example, who grew up in the 1950s and the 1960s, think of America as a different kind of place racially. And they get a little bit, I guess, excited or upset about the growth in immigrants, the growth in Latinos in the United States. It's not something that affected their voting patterns to a great degree in previous elections, but in 2016, I think largely because of the message of the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, who wanted to make America great again, and again meaning, well, let's go back to the 50s, I think, in the eyes of a lot of these folks in terms of the racial composition. And of course, Trump also talked a lot about building a wall across the Mexican border, all kinds of sort of negative things he said about some of the racial minorities in the United States. I think he fanned the flames of some of this divide, and a lot of these older whites became even more anxious than they might have been in other elections. As we see millennials be taking a bigger role in the election moving forward, perhaps even turning out in a midterm, which young people hardly ever do, that they may also have a role. This younger, more diverse generation may have a bigger role even in 2018 than it had in 2016, and certainly will have a bigger role in elections going forward. So I think this cultural generation gap, older whites versus younger minorities, is going to play out, and eventually these younger minorities are going to have a much bigger say in the results of the elections coming forward.